we are again, and Leslie has asked me to just say a few more fundamental things about this work called Feldenkrais, named after Moshe Feldenkrais, as you may know by now, and what it differentiates it from other approaches. Not to make it therefore better, that's not for me to judge, you have to judge that for yourselves, but why would someone find this approach more enlightening or helpful than another approach? Now, one of Feldenkrais' favorite sentences has always been, if you know what you do, you can do what you want, which may not be strictly true always, but that was one of his premises. First of all, we have to find out what we do. What he, on an experiential level, explored some more than half a century ago was the experience that if he discovered his pattern, whatever it was in his case, always around his damaged knee, then he could stop and think about, has he got other options rather than what he's doing? Is what he's doing, his pattern, producing more pain or producing limited amount of freedom? And would he have other ways of thinking about the same intent, whatever he wanted to do with his body or his knee, that wouldn't produce the same result? And now a very quick scientific detour. What is now recognized and known through neuroplasticity and the whole kind of machinery we have to look at the brain is that every thought we have produces a response in something called the motor cortex. Thinking in the brain is placed next to the motor cortex. Well, the response of our thinking, not the thinking itself. Thinking is not located anywhere, but it's the brain. Thinking makes use of the brain to translate it into something. Now, every thought we have produces a muscular response because the motor cortex responds with a muscular response to our thoughts. When I have the thought of reaching my arm to the ceiling, then of course I know the outcome of that thought in my action, although I may not be aware of exactly what I was thinking other than the intent. But when I'm reading, for instance, unknown to me, every word I see forms already a muscular response in the brain. And when children learn to read, they mouth their words very slowly, very carefully, because this link between the visual and then the muscular potential behind it is very important, and then we get more prolific and we can do it faster and faster. And speed reading apparently is when there's no more muscular response. You just visualize it and you see a page or at least a line and take it in. So what Feldenkrais realized, in order to make a change in his body, he had to change his thinking. But before he could change his thinking, he had to be aware of what he was actually doing. Otherwise, where would he think differently from? So, if that makes some sense, I give you an example. My pattern in my body is to have my pelvis always rotated a bit, so my left hip, therefore my left sit bone, sorry, I just picked the pelvis up again, and I exaggerate, this happens. At the same time, doing this, I'm also doing a tiny bit of this. So my right sit bone has habitually more weight than my left sit bone. My left sit bone is habitually further forward than my right sit bone. And it was only through Feldenkrais' work that I suddenly realized why in trains I would choose the seats I would choose. It had nothing to do with traveling forwards and backwards. It had to do that I always like to have the window on my right side because I prefer, for whatever reason, that rotation. which brings my left hip forward and for whatever other reason lift it a bit. I can do the other, but this is home and this is not quite the same. So that's why I don't choose forwards and backwards, and people say, where do you want to sit? No, I'd like to sit so I can turn, rotate that way. Anyway, so here's my pelvis, slightly rotated and slightly lifted. The traditional approach would be that maybe a practitioner, a therapist, a riding teacher would say, stop rotating your pelvis, bring your left hip back, your left hip bone as we call it, your left sit bone back, and put more weight on the left side. In other words, the traditional approach is correction. Now, if we all could become perfect through correction, we would all be perfect. It's very easy, I think it's very easy for most of us to see what someone else is doing so-called wrong, or what their pattern is. And we say, don't do this, do that. And they try very hard, and they try very hard, and off they go again. Again, I'm not saying this is right and wrong. I want to emphasize the different or additional approach. So, first of all, I may not be aware of what I'm doing. And the person I'm trying to help may not be aware of what he or she is doing. So how about inviting that person to bring that left sit bone, therefore the left part of the pelvis, further and further forward, make the left sit bone lighter and lighter and lighter, till that person suddenly says, but I'm not in the middle. And then the so-called self-correcting element can start, because our nervous system will always try its best to get us back to a place of neutrality, because that's the safest place from which to act. So, if you have now, as you're sitting there, figured out for yourselves that one sit bone is a bit lighter than the other, or the pelvis is slightly rotated to your belly button, may not be pointing forwards but may point a bit more left and right, can you exaggerate your pattern a bit? Just say, that's what I'm doing, interesting. The body can never do wrong. It may not be the best approach to the given intent, but how can anybody say that is wrong? And you come back from that, and you do it again. And you come back from it. It is, to use a wonderful phrase which I may have used before by one of my teachers, Lucy Alon, saying, allow the body to find the way home. Again and again. And after a few repetitions, you may or you may not find that your sitting is a bit more neutral. And then you can say, okay, I can do this. If I take this pelvis again and emphasize mine, I can do this and that. And I can come back. That's the potential of the beginning of changing the pattern. Can I also do this? And come back. In other words, can I begin to introduce variety? Can I also just allow both sit bones to be there, and from that position go very gently once this way, once that way? So rather than correcting, we say, I'm very good at one option, and that may be the best option for a given situation. Now can I become equally good at other options? So in my motor cortex, which stores all the muscular patterns, there's a big larder full of options. And my nervous system will go shopping for the best possible ingredients for any intent I have. Okay, and then in order to have some, just to have some more playful elements, or elements that exaggerate our pattern a bit more, I can take one of these balls, or you can take rolled up walking socks, something that has a certain thickness, and put it under one sit bone. I put it under my left sit bone for the moment, and I might just, because just sitting there is a bit boring, I might just look up a bit and down a bit and look a bit left and look a bit right. I might stroke one leg, I might stroke the other leg, but all the time my left sit bone is slightly raised. And then after a while I take the ball out, and it's important that we allow ourselves time to learn to read our own body. So it's not a must, oh my goodness, the world has changed. It hasn't. It's a question of, if we give it a bit of attention, is the sensory feedback from, as it is my left sit bone now, and it is different from before when I didn't put that ball there. And then you think, there must be a rule, you put it on the lighter sit bone. No, there is no rule, because it might be for some people, for whatever reason, more important to put it under the heavier sit bone, which lifts that side a bit. And again, do, whatever, brush your hair, not quite, but, move around a bit, distract a bit from what you have done there, because your nervous system now is busy saying, what on earth? Just by the way, if any of these activities hurt and you're challenging a pattern for whatever reason that is there too much, because every pattern has an original reason, then please modify it, just put the handkerchief there or just your own hand, but don't do anything that hurts. And then again after a while, take it out. And now for me, that has emphasized my pattern. I'm sinking down there more. Interesting. And what is it like to sit on both? Actually, it's quite nice. And could I from there a bit turn in my pattern? Could I from there turn a bit in what is not my familiar pattern? Do I notice how the balancing necessity, so I don't fall off the chair, kicks in along the spine and the ribs? Because I'm not just a stick. And again, I let this sensory information, partly consciously, and a lot of it is unconsciously, just sit there. And then again, I take these things away, and then sit like this. And what does that feel like? So it's not so much a matter of judging of right and wrong. It's a matter of learning to read ourselves. So again, to come back to the phrase at the beginning, if I know what I do, then I can do what I want. Again, within certain limitations, because I may want to fly. Well, I can't. There are laws of physics. Some of you may already know this wonderful gadget. It doesn't have to be this color or sprinkled. It can even be smaller. It's called a sit fit. Now, one of the things, especially on horseback, but of course in everyday life anyway, is the question of balance. And falling off a horse is not always a nice experience. Is it that we're falling off a horse because we are actually not noticing that we're already unbalanced on the horse, and then muscles try and fix us to stop us from falling, which actually makes us more unbalanced? And could we, in a safe environment, not on horseback, on a chair, explore how we respond to what originally may feel like instability? So this stool, an ordinary stool, of course, is on terra firma, in itself, a firm thing. I mean, unless I really behave very badly or I've drunk too much, I can't fall off. So I'm not asked upon allowing my system to find an inner balance so much, unless I play with these things. Now, I'm going to put this sit fit underneath. It's bigger than the chair, doesn't matter. And immediately, it's filled with air, not water. So if you puncture it, you can't sort of worry that you flood your house. Immediately I feel the slightest movement looking up or reaching with my hand for something or whatever, there's a wobble going on. and the pressure on my feet changes according to this wobble. And after a few initial moments of surprise, thinking what's going on, if you allow yourself in this situation to explore movements, one hip forward, therefore one other leg forward, looking up a bit, looking down a bit, turning a bit, tilting a bit, you find that the demand for self-preservation, therefore the demand for the whole of the skeleton to balance out all the time what's happening underneath your bum, becomes much more urgent and much more available to notice. And so in itself it's a wonderful thing, even sitting at the desk or at your computer, well, it might be the same thing, for just for a few moments. If you sit on this, it also makes you more alert, because it wakens up your senses, and often it helps to deal with the stiffness that has built up as a compensation for lack of balancing out of the bones. So it's, afterwards a chair like this feels quite boring. It's called a sit fit. If you Google it, you find them on the internet. This one, just in case you're interested, has a diameter of 36 centimeters. I always think the bigger ones are more useful than the small ones, but that's because I have a big bum. So if you are a skinny little person, you might be happy with a smaller one, but I think it's a wonderful thing. You could also, by the way, put it underneath your feet. If you're very brave, put it on your saddle and see what happens. But there, especially for the elderly, which of course I qualify for, there are lots of balancing classes. Now, if everybody was given by the National Health Service one of these, that I might save an awful lot of money and an awful lot of problems. So, anyway, I'm not getting commission for it, by the way. It's just a wonderful gadget which I've had for many years. You can create instability with these balls and so on, but it's not quite the same. So that's a wonderful tool to have. Okay, now practice your looking at somebody, and here I am, I'm the only person you're looking at the moment. And I'm not a perfect specimen, nor am I interested in being a perfect specimen. I know my pattern, and I'm just asking you for a few moments, as you say, I'm not doing anything deliberate, I try and be as much myself as whatever I can be standing here in front of the camera. Now think of, and you remember, I'm looking at the skeleton picture, that we have 12 pairs of ribs. Of course they are attached to the sternum, at least half of them, and then some indirectly to the sternum, and then they go around and attach to the spine. The first rib is underneath the collarbone, high up, and the bottom rib is, the bottom two ribs are the floating ribs, where people often are very ticklish. Anyway, and these ribs have a certain distance from one another. Now I know that I prefer to carry my bag, shoulder bag, over one shoulder. Would it be the shoulder that is habitually lower, or would it be the shoulder that's habitually higher? Would you, looking at me, know which shoulder I carry my shoulder bag on? So, and often people say, oh, her shoulder girdle or his shoulder girdle is not level. It's most cases has to do with what the underlying ribs are doing. That the ribs on one side may be like this, and on the other side they may be like this, or like this and like that. And that might be because the spine might be bending more one way or the other way. There are many, many reasons. The interesting thing is, and has been for me to notice, why do I prefer carrying my shoulder bag, and I tell you now, on my right shoulder. And I can carry it, but it keeps sliding off. Like a client to me said once, jokingly, I'm going to take this bra back to Marks and Spencer's because my left strap keeps sliding off. Anyway, so my habit is to stand, wearing, that's nothing to do with the shoulder girdle, to have my ribs slightly more open on this side, which of course also makes this lift, so there's altogether there's a wonderful pattern coming on, and it drops my right sit bone lower down. And again I could say, oh, I noticed that, okay, let's just do something about that, and let's just, instead of doing this, do this. Correction. Nothing wrong with correction if we could get away from the word of correction and say, do I know of other options? Can I go shopping in my movement computer, i.e. motor cortex, for other things? If I have rice and salt in my store cupboard, there's nothing wrong with rice and salt, but I can't cook many meals with it. So if I'm all the time, and I exaggerate now, like this, then I'm like this, and if I want to scratch my left leg, then that's a wonderful place to be. Then I would go like this. But I don't always want to scratch my left leg, I sometimes want to scratch my right leg. But first, in order to become really aware, could I begin to scratch, stroke my left leg to such an extent that I suddenly say, I don't want to walk around like that. That's huge exaggeration. And then come back. And like before in sitting, I can do that many, many times. I feel how the weight shift under my feet changes. I feel my pelvis moving. Of course, I feel these shoulders sitting on the ribs that lower, getting lower. I take my head into, or I could leave it out, I take it into the picture and come back. After having reinforced my pattern, becoming aware of what I'm doing, and allowing the body to find the way home, back to neutrality, that very often is enough to have a more neutral position. And then I say, but I want to increase my options. And the increasing of my options is that I want to be able to scratch my right leg as well. So how can I do that? And there may be a physical reason, an old injury or deterioration of something where that is uncomfortable. So then don't think, oh, I have got to do it, make it smaller. I can just do this, then I can do that, then I can do this, then I can do that. The options. I can think the movement, I want to make this side longer again, thinking I'm shortening my left side. I could also think by doing it, lengthening my right side more. Or I can think, sorry, I just get an implement. If my ribs are left and right exactly the same, neutral, then my spine is like this. If my ribs on my right side, I know it would be your left side looking at it, but that's too complicated for me. Anyway, on this side, if the ribs are spread out more, it makes the spine do that. You see here, they come closer together. So I could think, okay, I'm bending my spine more this way. I could think of it from the point of view of spine. Or I'm shortening my other side more. So that's another interesting aspect of this work, that there are many, many ways of starting a movement. And the more ways you have to put your ignition key in your body, the more chance is that you won't be stuck. If I can only move, straighten, scratch, not straighten, scratch my left leg by thinking of my left hand moving down, and I have no other way of thinking, and for some reason I can't do that, I'm stuck. In the Feldenkrais training, we often had to think of the same movement and have at least 3 different starting points. And then of course the interesting thing was to look at people and say, can we mind read and see where it started from? So if you know one movement, like bending, can you think it from the left side? Can you think it from the right side? Can you think it from tipping the shoulder girdle? Can you think it from allowing the spine to bend sideways? Could you initiate it with the head? Could you initiate it by shifting the weight on your feet? And every time it's the same outcome. The more ignition points we have in the body, unlike a car, the more potential we have to actually carry on doing what we want to do if one, it's like diversions in traffic, if one road, one thought process is being blocked. That's very difficult, okay. One interesting thought is, if we have an intent, do we follow that intent through with our action? Or do we suddenly change the action without even noticing? And that, of course, is not just for riding, it's in everyday life. And do we change our action because we encounter a problem, or we go back into our own habits? And I just want to tell you a little story that has just come to my mind, where a Feldenkrais trainer was asked by one of the students if he could explain exactly what was happening. He was probably at the beginning of his training a bit, and he says, you know, I go home and I roll around on the floor and it feels lovely. And now I noticed that I'm sometimes going on the floor and rolling around, but I'm giving myself, like what I'm doing in a moment, more prescribed picture. In other words, I put my thinking behind my action, and the difference is quite enormous. And Feldenkrais, it wasn't Feldenkrais, but that teacher on Feldenkrais said the same somewhere, said, well, if you do things without thinking, you do them in your habitual way, nothing wrong, but, and here that's Feldenkrais who says, exercise strengthens everything, including our defects. So if we actually, through what we're doing, become aware of what we're doing, then again, we have a different set of tools at our fingertips. So, the example that I'm going to give you lying on the floor, and it's up to Leslie to get me into the picture. Here I am, legs bent, here's my pelvis. And one thing which a lot of you may be familiar with is called the pelvic clock. So rather than just drawing a circle with the pelvis on the floor, and if it was printed out, you may see that it is a rugby ball or a potato, or, you know, a circle is a circle geometrically, there's no discussion. It's either a circle or it's something else. And I'm doing it clockwise or anti-clockwise in what is my habit. What is on the forefront, most available from my motor cortex, the thinking of a clock, of a circle. These muscles are being activated and off I go. And there's nothing wrong, it's comfortable, it feels nice to do. But now I'm doing it differently. I'm imagining that I'm lying with the back of my pelvis, also the back of the spine, sorry, the pelvis is a bit old, on a clock face. So my sacrum, which is the base of the spine, and a bit of my lumbar spine is actually lying on a clock face. Now we all know what good old-fashioned clocks look like. It can be as tiny as my watch dial, or it can be something like a clock dial. That doesn't matter. The interesting thing is the perfect symmetry of a clock. Symmetry that each hour is the same distance from the center, and each 5 minutes, we're not going into minutes, we go from 5 minutes to 5 minutes, it's the same distance from the next 5-minute number. So where you see the clock doesn't matter. If I say, as I roll the pelvis, again, on pelvis, as I roll the pelvis this way and my lumbar spine lifts, I'm at 12 o'clock. If I roll my pelvis over towards the right, I'm coming on to 3 o'clock, I'm coming on to 6 o'clock, I'm coming on to 9 o'clock, I'm coming down to 12 o'clock. So it might be interesting, first of all, to check, is 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock available? Available in terms of comfort, available in terms of clear image. And then the next interesting question is, are all these 12, 3, 6, 9, or if you see 12 here, it doesn't matter, are they all same distance to the center? And I may find that that's my habit, that I'm rolling with far greater enthusiasm to the 3 o'clock over to the right, than I'm going to my, what would be 9 o'clock, over towards the left, because I told at the beginning, that's my sitting in the train position. So the correction would be that I would say, this 9 o'clock has to become bigger, and it might, which actually at the moment is slightly be uncomfortable for my muscles on the right side. That would be the correction. Or I could say, I'm going to 9 o'clock as far as it's comfortable, and then all the other hours, the 12, the 3, the 6, adapt to the smallest common denominator. It may not be the 9 o'clock, it could be the 10, the 11, the 12, the 1, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, the hours in between. So what is, again to come back to the example of the student who asked the trainer, why do I feel so much better afterwards? Or clearer or freer, whatever, it's because now his thinking invites him to actually take notice which of these hours he can access very easily and where does he not do a clock but cut the corner. Some people cut whole quarters of an hour off. And then what can we do, making it smaller and smaller and smaller till all hours can be reached with equal ease. So it's always about, does our action match our intent, and its quality coming first, quantity follows the quality. You could, if it's all a bit difficult, take again a sock or a ball, put it under your sacrum, and just say the circumference, the diameter of this little ball, is actually the size of the clock. And I'm just sort of, I could almost say, fall off the ball at 12 o'clock, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. What? And go backwards, just do half an hour at the bottom, half an hour on the left side, half an hour on the right side. What is it for me to recognize where I'm using my pelvic area, therefore the muscles in the lumbar spine unevenly? And I think if Feldenkrais had done nothing but talked of pelvic clock, I already think it would be a wonderful tool of balancing out an area in our body, and on horseback it comes out in particular, that this correction cannot be balanced out. So size doesn't matter, quality and intent and action matching, that matters. So to summarize all these ideas again, what this work is about, it's not about movement, it's very strange, it's about our awareness, it's awareness through movement. The movement becomes a medium in which we sharpen, rediscover our awareness. Our awareness of our habits, but always based on the understanding of the human skeleton. If we don't have a reference point that is the same for all of us, which happens to be nature, our skeleton is part of nature, and the laws of physics that govern our skeleton and that govern the whole of nature, then it's all gobbledygooks. And so in order to become aware of our habits, the thoughtfulness, the slowness, the inquiry, like sometimes I say to people, could you actually stop at 1 o'clock and have a cup of tea? Could you stop at 5 o'clock, wherever it happens for you to be, and have a cup of tea? What about 9 o'clock or whatever? In other words, do you notice where you suddenly rush something, and it's very often we rush where we are not that comfortable, we want to get past that. And to notice those moments, here's something interesting is going on. I'm not talking of pain now. If something is painful, go close to it, but don't repeat pain. And what can you learn there? And very often it's simply we all have habits, and we need habits, otherwise Leslie won't know how to move out of my house again, which would be very awkward for her and me. So let's not knock habits, but because in this work and in all of you specific to riding, you want to be more aware of what you are doing that may not be so helpful to the horse and to the riding experience, then you have to really sit down, or whatever, stand up, lie down, and use these actions not as an exercise program to get stronger, but as I said, as a means of exploring and becoming aware of, like I became aware in the train, that's why I prefer, no matter if the train goes forwards or backwards, because I actually prefer that rotation. It may have to do with my eyes, it may have to do with my hearing, it may have to do how the way I was lying in my mother's womb. Doesn't matter. What matters is that I say, that's the reason. That patterns my left hip coming forward, it patterns a bit of shift of weight, it patterns that the rib cage is slightly rotated, all these things. So again, the pattern that we have should not and need not be discarded, but through slow explorations we can add variety, and that variety allows again our nervous system to have a better choice for a given action. So tiny, slow. Remember, you are not moving to exercise or to run away from something, you are moving to learn to read yourself. So you don't have to rely on mirrors, or you don't have to rely on a teacher all the time to tell you what you're doing. So if you know what you do, then you have choices. Now, Leslie tells me that's the last comment here at the moment, and that has to do with the eyes. Now, we are focusing on the eyes, but of course there might be people who haven't got eyesight, and they will have to focus on hearing, on sense of smell. Basically, our head contains our sensory organs, apart from the proprioception, which is sensing ourselves, which of course goes all over the body. But a lot of riders ride, and with all their good intent of focusing, they're actually not looking around where they're looking too much down at the horse. That's one thing, and then their neck has to do more work to get them more upright. So and the horses, when you watch them when they turn, if they can actually allow their eyes to be part of the intent that they are given, turning right and left, then you know that the rest follows. Feldenkrais says somewhere, he never talked of so-called brain damaged children. He always said, if I can capture a child's attention through vision or hearing, then I can organize that child's body. I mean, that's what he said, so don't quote me on that, but it's an interesting thought. So what you could explore for yourselves is, for instance, just very simply, I'm sitting on the floor, you could sit on a chair, move your head up, nose to the ceiling and nose to the ground. And most likely your eyes will follow that movement. It's neither right nor wrong, we don't look with the end of the nose. But what is interesting is to observe is this kind of symbiosis between head movement and eye movement. And sometimes that symbiosis becomes too muscularly interlocked. Or if I turn my face, for whatever reason, towards the right, the chances my eyes will go that way as well, which of course makes sense. But what you could play with for yourselves is, if it helps, have a finger ready, and as your nose goes upwards, allow your eyes to follow the finger downwards. And as your nose goes downwards, allow your eyes to follow the finger upwards. And you may first have all sorts of problems. It's actually easier to do with someone who could do the finger movements, or as my head goes towards the right, my eyes follow the finger towards the left and vice versa. So these are, for ourselves, very interesting and quite useful explorations to make sure that our neck muscles and the eye muscles are not too knotted together and actually begin to restrict one another rather than giving each other that freedom. How that translates onto the horse, that's another story. I don't think the horse would necessarily follow that, but for yourselves, just realizing how important your awareness of what you're doing with your eyes is and what consequences it has on the rest of the body. So when we talk of ignition keys in the body earlier on, you could do all these actions starting with your eyes, or with your right ear, with your left ear.